Conventionally, the globalists are correctly postponing the nuclear war until what? China's ready. Because China does have the manpower.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't think occupation is necessarily a given in the U.S. because you've got 1 billion arms in private hands, and that's a recipe for guerrilla warfare, par none. And, it stems from this. It stems from this fairy tale doctrine that everybody who came to Earth, of the 2/3, raised their arm to the square and supported the gospel in Jesus Christ, and it's simply not true. I mean, you have in Abraham chapter 5 about Cain, where the Lord says, you were master mayhem and perdition before the world was. Now, a person who's perdition before the world was did not raise his hand to the square. He came down as an ally of Satan. That's why he's master mayhem, powerful over Satan, because he got to come to Earth, get a body, and learn all the things about Earth. Like the newest apostle, talking about how refugees are so wonderful and you've got to be accommodating, and he never discusses the political agenda behind moving refugees into the country. He only sees the humanitarian aspect, and the whole liberal world lauds him for his kindliness, his gentleness, his softness, and he is all that. I'm not saying that he isn't good, but you see, there is a lack of understanding about the great threats that we face, about conspiracy, about secret combinations of power which are in the government.
All right. Welcome once again to the program, Joel Skousen. This is his third time being back here, and I'm so thankful for that. I would like to once again introduce you as the political scientist by training, specializing in the philosophy of law and constitutional theory. And you are also a designer of high security residences and retreats, which I would like to talk to you about one of these days. He has designed self-sufficient and high security homes throughout North America and has consulted in Central America as well. So it's not just here in the States. His latest book in this field is Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. And just correct me in any places that I might be getting wrong or maybe not updated. He is active in consulting with persons who need to relocate for security and increased self-sufficiency. He also assists people who need to live near a large city to develop contingency retreat plans involving rural farm or recreation property. Joel was raised in Oregon and later served as a fighter pilot for the U.S. Marine Corps during the Vietnam era prior to beginning his design from specializing in high security residences and retreats. During the 80s, he took a leave of absence to serve as the chairman of the Conservative National Committee in Washington, D.C., and concurrently served as the executive editor of Conservative Digest. For 2 years, he published a newsletter entitled The World Affairs Brief. You still do that, though?
Yes. In fact, that's my main occupation now.
Yes, you still do that. So I need to change that because I get that periodically. And served as a senior editor of Cogitations, a quarterly journal on law and government. The World Affairs Brief is now back in publication and is available. Actually, you've been back for how long?
Since the year 2000. It's been going on for 20.
I've got an old bio here. I need to update.
23 years, and I haven't missed it. 23 years, and I haven't missed an issue.
That's right. Jay sends it to me religiously, and I love it. His main area of focus in the weekly brief is the hidden globalist agenda behind U.S. foreign and domestic policy. He has developed a working theory to explain the West's conflicting policies of both supporting and attacking at different times and places, seemingly contradictory positions on terrorism, communist-backed revolutions, drugs, money laundering, and organized crime. And we know that is rampant. His unique point of view is widely appreciated in conservative circles. And of course, you're an author of many books on law and government and many innovations in security architecture. Welcome back to the program, Joel.
Thank you, Troy. The only correction is I'm largely retired now at nearing 80 years old from my design work. I still consult, however, but most of my effort is dedicated to alerting people to the secret combinations and what they're doing to us in modern times through my weekly World Affairs Brief.
Absolutely. And how do people get that? Is that a newsletter? I know I get it sent to me, but how would you explain that?
Well, it is a newsletter, and there's a modest fee, $48 a year for people to support my work. And but it comes every day, every week, every Friday into the email box that you have, or you can log in online and read it online. There's also a PDF version and an audio version if people want to listen to it in their car. So, and at the end of each brief is a preparation tip by my engineer son, Andrew, about preparedness every week. And that's one of those popular aspects of the World Affairs Brief. Your listeners can get a free sample copy by going to worldaffairsbrief.com and clicking on Request a Sample on the left-hand side.
Absolutely. And I do have the links in the description section, as I always have since he's been on the program. So look for all of Joel's links in the descriptions. Now, I am ready for my chastisement. I know you I'll just dive into it because I have a few. I want this to be a smorgasbord. I got a plethora of little things I wanted you to hit on, if you could, that are going on currently as we speak in the world. And I was wondering if you could hit on some of those. But first and foremost, I'm still learning. I know I had Matt Harris on, and you said Troy is not sophisticated enough to go up against Matt Harris. And one of the specific things was about McCarthyism. I am learning every day. So it was Ben later after the interview mentioned to me about the Venona papers, right?
Yes.
Can you explain what? Okay, so McCarthyism. Most people know what that is. Where did I go wrong there? And what are the Venona papers?
Well, Harris was making the traditional mainstream narrative that McCarthy was full of beans, and then he accused a lot of people falsely of having communist connections, which was totally untrue. McCarthy had his flaws. But he was right about the communists in the State Department as well as in Hollywood, et cetera. And most important, the major period in history which McCarthy followed on was the Roosevelt and Truman administration, where you had active communists and globalists who had joined the Communist Party to facilitate the building up of Russia as a future enemy and China as a future enemy. Directly implicated with the Communist Party. And the Venona transcripts after the phony fall of the Soviet Union, when they did open their archives, at least a portion of them, did confirm that there were so many communists including Alger Hiss and Harry Hopkins, and who gave the rest of the nuclear secrets to the Russians that they couldn't steal from the Manhattan Project. I mean, massive espionage. Alger Hiss, of course, helped negotiate with Stalin and give Stalin the entire Eastern Europe set of countries after World War II, including Operation Keelhaul, where the U.S. agreed to forcibly repatriate all of the Eastern Europeans, even those that had never lived in Russia. They were forced back, and General Eisenhower, who was not a communist, as you know, Harris makes a big thing out of Robert Welch of the Birch Society calling him a communist.
Right.
He was not a communist, but he was a globalist who actually, as globalists do, they do the bidding a lot of communism in order to build them up. Some of them even unknowingly. I don't know how much he was involved in the overall bigger globalist conspiracy, but George Catlett Marshall, for example, was a globalist within his administration that gave away China in 1949 to the communists by cutting off military aid to Chiang Kai-shek after he would not be forced into a coalition government with the communists, with Mao, because he knew that they always take over and control when you get into a coalition government. So Marshall cut off military aid. Wikipedia says that the reason that Mao won is because the Chiang Kai-shek didn't have any support of his military troops and they were all defecting. Well, you'd defect too if you ran out of ammunition and the U.S. wasn't providing any more supplies. So you see, Wikipedia never tells the full story. They always hide, of course, the true conspiratorial history of things.
Yeah.
But yes, McCarthy was right. He was, obnoxious and outspoken and had his other problems, but he wasn't wrong about the communist influence. So it was a terribly stupid mistake for Harris to promulgate that mainstream propaganda. But I did take just, great objection to Harris's criticism of Ezra Taft Benson. I mean, he is an anti-Bensonite, and he's purely anti-Benson, was just delighted in the fact that Benson bought into the problems of Robert Welch and Cullen.
You mean it was obvious that he had an axe to grind? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Well, yeah, but he failed to realize the great inspiration of Benson in focusing on the secret combinations of the Book of Mormon, and made the egregious comments about him misinterpreting that as applying to modern days. Well, of course it applies to modern day. Moroni goes out of his way to warn the American Gentiles that if you let these secret combinations take over, and he's talking about secret in government, not the mafia, not the Taliban. He says it will be too late, and we have already let it happen. It's too late to take them out. And they've completely infested all of our law enforcement in the federal level and in many state levels at government. So Harris is all wet about that. Now, to Benson's credit, we have to remember that to Benson, the major conspiracy was the communist conspiracy as he was growing. He saw it firsthand. Harris is right about Benson being extremely motivated about going to Eastern Europe and seeing the tragedy of what happened post-Soviet or post-World War II in Soviet Eastern Europe and the starvation that was going on there. But he fails to realize, or Benson failed to realize, that there was also concurrent with the globalist or with the communist agenda, a globalist conspiracy as well, which uses the communists to break down the social order so they can come in and rescue it in their milder form of socialism, which is just as evil, satanic controlled like communism. But anyway, it's a complex subject, but
Yeah.
To denigrate Benson over that one error and the fact that he wrote letters to other general authorities wanting them to read Welch's book, but Welch was right on many other things too. So he paints with a very broad brush against the right wing.
Yeah, definitely.
A left wing professor at any university is going to denigrate those that he considers on the right.
There was obvious biases there, and he's going to be on the program again about another book, which I approached him objectively because I love Ezra Taft Benson. I love Vincent B. Kimball. Matt, like other scholars that I've had on the program, have their favorites, and they usually seem to be those like Hugh B. Brown and others that kind of. Well, how did you feel about some of the letters that were exchanged between these apostles? It's obvious that they do disagree on things, but then Matt's leaving out 25 years of them being together and praying about things, doing things together as a brethren. He's taking 5 minutes of a letter where Ezra Taft Benson's calling Hugh B. Brown a communist, and Hugh B. Brown is saying, you should have never been ordained an apostle or whatever. I don't know. But how do you feel about some of these exchanges between the brethren? Does that show them as being a little bit more human?
Well, they are very human, and they carry a lot of their human proclivities with them into the quorum of the 12. Fortunately, in those days, David O. McKay was the president of the church who, when he spoke, there didn't have to be unanimity. He got everyone's opinion when he spoke. That's the final word, and that's the way it should be. Nowadays, you run into a system whereby it's kind of like the majority rules. Even in Benson's day, he wanted to call his son Reed to be an apostle, and the other rest of the apostles didn't want him because he was too right-wing, so to speak. And so he backed down rather than use his prerogative to overrule, the other opinions. He also wanted the author of The Great and Abominable Church.
Richard, was it Anderson?
Yeah.
I know his name. I
Yes,
keep wanting to say
Anderson,
Lloyd
brother,
Anderson, but
no,
it's
Brother Anderson. It's not Lloyd. But in any case, they rejected that as well, but they reluctantly decided to.
Yeah, I know. It's on the tip of my tongue.
Reluctantly allowed him to become one of the 70s. And he was, Brother Hinckley actually made him the call. And he said, Brother Anderson, I want you to realize that
Verlin Anderson.
H. Verlin
Anderson. Yeah.
A great patriot. He wrote the book, The Great and Abominable Church, and believed in conspiracy and the reform and interpreting the Constitution according to the founders' desires and its inspired nature. But when Brother Hinckley made the call to, in fact, H. Verlin Anderson told me this at his retirement party. So I know this firsthand from him. He said, before I die, I want to tell you how my call came. And President Hinckley said to me, I want you to know the only reason you're here is because of President Benson wants you. None of the rest of us want you.
Are you kidding me?
That's what he said. He said, you're never to talk about the Constitution or conspiracy to the members of the church. So that showed some hostility by Brother Hinckley to that position. And there's a lot of conservatives who believe that the brethren are just holding back, trying to protect the church from persecution. But Brother Hinckley in 1994 and 95 did condemn a lot of the things that conservatives believed in Friday sessions of General Conference, which is for general authorities only. And a lot of that was legitimate because there were about 100 families that were dissatisfied with Hinckley's leadership when Benson was incapacitated and left the church. As you know, President Hinckley was trying his best to bring the church into mainstream acceptance.
Right.
And that was his passion as a PR man.
He believed in a global, when I say global, I don't mean that as globalist. I mean, he did believe. He wanted an international, let's just say international.
Yeah, but he didn't see the globalist danger. He spoke before the World Federalist a couple of times in very glowing terms. And these are globalist organizations that believe in destroying American sovereignty. He didn't see that because that implies that the church would have no objection to a global new world order where we lose our individual sovereignty and under global control. And we do object to that. This nation was established as the only free nation of the earth with and all the Western nations have basically copied a lot of our Constitution and our legal system and followed suit. But now it's all been corrupted by the deep state influence. And every Western country of the world, they all have their deep state components. They all have their secret surveillance. They all have their dark side of their intelligence agencies spying on their citizens. But, the brethren are resistant to that because Brother Hinckley told the general authorities in 1994 and 95 that there is no conspiracy in government. And said he believed it was false doctrine that Russia and China would ever attack us. You see, he was trying, and when he was president, he had all of the leaders of China come over to the Polynesian Cultural Center in Hawaii and just lavished praise on them, which I have real problems with, knowing of their communist genocidal tactics and their hatred for the West and their intention to strike the West that is ongoing even now. It'll happen someday.
Well, and it's interesting because if there are brethren that can disagree with Ezra Taft Benson, who later ironically becomes prophet, so the Lord wants him as the mouthpiece of the Lord is choosing him as prophet, seer, and revelator.
They are the only ones authorized. So I can always raise my hand, to agree that they are prophets, but really in potentially, they're the only ones authorized to act for the Lord in that.
I guess what I'm saying is, if we can have some brethren like Hinckley and others disagree with Hinckley, we can have some come back and disagree with today's narrative and go, we need to preserve the Constitution. We need to stand up for what's right. In other words, if we've got some, obviously there was some polarization there and disagreement. It can go back that way, couldn't it? Will we ever see conservative?
No, it won't.
Okay, go ahead.
Only if there's a correction by revelation. Because you see, the way that the church operates, as President Lee told my uncle, W. Joel Skousen, when he became the new prophet, he said, Cleon, I want you to stop criticizing government. And Cleon said to him, well, are you speaking for the Lord or are you speaking for yourself? And President Lee said, well, you don't understand. We haven't received direct revelation in many, many years. And in the absence of direct revelation, we do what we think is best, and we expect the Lord to correct us if we're wrong. Now, President Hinckley was obviously wrong about saying there's no conspiracy in government. Has the Lord corrected him? No. President Brigham Young was absolutely wrong when he talked about Adam as God the Father in his Adam God doctrines. For over 30 years, he preached that. He was wrong. Did the Lord correct him? No.
Right. It was even in the temple ceremony.
He put it into the temple ceremony in St. George. Lasted for many, many hours. And he even excommunicated 2 bishops in St. George for disagreeing with him on that. They were quietly reinstated after Brigham Young died. And the church even denied that Brigham Young believed in the Adam God doctrine. In fact, there was a statement by Joseph F. Smith, who was a counselor to Brigham Young during that period when he was preaching the doctrine, who made the statement about Brigham Young not believing it. But he knew better. But it was politically correct for the church to deny such an embarrassing doctrine as that. But prophets do make mistakes, and the Lord allows that for several reasons. Number one, he allows the anti-Mormons and the skeptics to have an easy excuse to not to believe in the church if they don't get a spiritual conversion to the Book of Mormon, which is where our faith really rests, is this great scripture that was revealed to the prophet Joseph Smith, that anyone who is spiritually sensitive can feel the Spirit of the Lord in the Book of Mormon. That's how I have my testimony. That's how my brother Royal, who did the great critical text project on the Book of Mormon, not only did he not lose his testimony in doing all the critical text work, which is analyzing all the changes and errors in the transcription process, but he says, it's very obvious this was a revealed manuscript. He read English out of the stone. He didn't have to think it out in his mind. You could talk to yourself blue in the face all day long trying to figure out what a hieroglyphic meant. But he read English out of the stone, and he has the proof of how certain things were corrected, which could only have been corrected by reading it out of the stone, that you couldn't come to these conclusions, like the spelling of the name Coriantumr with an MR ending instead of an MER.
Right.
Can't get that from English.
No. And I want you to know that my brother and I have that same testimony. We gained a testimony by the power of the Holy Ghost from the Book of Mormon. And it tarried with me for a whole hour, brother. I know what you're saying is true. The Holy Ghost bore witness to me of the divinity of that book.
You see, and that's the weakness of a lot of the converts that are coming in the church when you fellowship them into the church. Now, I'm not denigrating fellowship. That's a very important thing, but it shouldn't be the primary means of which people come into the church because they've been befriended. There's so much anti-Mormon material out there, and, we're losing hundreds of thousands of our youth in the church because of the influence of woke public education and other things. And because we're afraid to talk about errors of the leaders. And so when they find out there have been errors by reading the anti-Mormon literature, which abounds on the net, they quickly lose their testimony because they can't understand that the Lord, you see, if the leaders were to have admitted here and say, we were wrong about that, and the Lord has corrected us, and we have decided this and that, it would give confidence to people that the leaders are human, that they can. I mean, like President Hinckley used $1 million of church tithing fund to buy the the Hoffman manuscript about the salamander letter, which turned out to be a forgery. And a lot of people said, well, isn't a prophet capable of detecting a forgery? Well, if they're looking for it, I guess. But he didn't see it. He wasn't corrected by the Lord. The church paid for it. Brother Hinckley if you read his biography, he's very clearly meant to be the prophet. You can't read the biography without seeing the Lord pushed him in the position to get to be known by the general authorities. And that's how apostles are chosen nowadays. They're chosen by the apostles observing people who are like-minded to them. So the softer your quorum of leaders gets in terms of, in the mold of President Hinckley, looking for people who won't disturb the world, won't, how should I say, be antagonistic toward the establishment world, who are friendly towards it. I mean, like the newest apostle, talking about how refugees are so wonderful and you've got to be accommodating, and he never discusses the political agenda behind moving refugees into the country and other things. He only sees the humanitarian aspect. And the whole liberal world lauds him for his kindliness, his gentleness, his softness. And he is all that. I'm not saying that he isn't good, but you see, there is a lack of understanding about the great threats that we face, about conspiracy, about secret combinations of power which are in the government. And that all stemmed from Brother Hinckley telling all of the general authorities clear back in the last century that there is no conspiracy in government, and none of them have believed in it since. And so he basically disarmed them towards even feeling prompted that something's deadly wrong here about the illegal immigration. The church is very friendly towards illegal immigration now because it's an opportunity for conversion. And I know I'm going wide range about various subjects, but prophets can be wrong, and the Lord has a reason for allowing them to be wrong. And I mentioned one of them, to allow people who don't want to believe in the church an easy out to say, how can it be true if the leaders, think that vaccines are a gift from God, which they clearly aren't. They make mistakes like that, and they don't apologize for it, or they don't even come to the truth about it. It really causes problems if people's testimonies are based in leadership rather than in the restoration of the gospel. But you see, we have to understand that the Lord has testing purposes too. It's a testing purpose for conservatives to see if they'll lose their testimony. I must field 100 questions a month from people emailing me as a faithful Latter-day Saint, asking how I can deal with the mistakes of, the current leadership in the church. Anti-gun, for example, or, pro-vaccine, or pro-unconditional love, or any number of problem things which they don't see. And I tell them, look, the Lord has his purposes here. Even though they might be in error, they're following the Lord's purposes. It's a test for you conservatives to see if you'll maintain and be faithful even when leaders disagree with what you know to be true.
Well,
let me just finish.
Sure.
But I'm telling, because the church is true, the Lord will issue a correction someday. The correction will come to the brethren. It won't come to some outsider like Denver Snuffer or anyone else pretending to be a new prophet of God or having seen the Christ. It'll come to the brethren because they are the only authorized ones to receive revelation. Now, that does not mean that other people cannot feel by the Spirit what is true and what is wrong, even in errors. It is a gross misunderstanding that you can't know any truth about any person unless you are called to be their home teacher or their ministry. That isn't true at all. You can know instantly by the Spirit of the Lord if somebody in your congregation is doing wrong or any number of things, or disregarding them. But you don't have the authority to correct or publicize that. You can know the truth about people and leaders and heirs and a bishop or a stake, but even though you aren't a bishop, but you don't have the power or the direction to correct that. And there's a difference there. But it is not true that you can't know anything unless you are a leadership in position about that leadership call. So what I'm just saying is that the Lord will correct all things are in error eventually. And the reason I say that is because the church, in a pro-worldly state, can't get to the New Jerusalem as constituted. It has to be a separation. There has to be a division. And who knows, but the Lord may be allowing people who are liberal, pro-worldly to get hardened in their position, so that when that correction comes, out of yes-manship to leadership, they will not repent, they will not change, and they won't get to the New Jerusalem. That's my feeling.
Yeah. It's interesting because a couple of things that you said resonated with me. First, why can't I stand up for what I know is politically right, or stand up for freedom, stand up against tyranny, and gather Israel at the same time? Why? I understand. Okay, so here's what I'm getting at. I have a
But
friend.
you can.
Exactly. That's my point. Is why
But
do you have to have one or
the
the
brethren
other?
do not want to, because they've been sold a bill of goods by their mainstream advisors that you will antagonize the world, you'll antagonize the fantastic, criticize them. And so they've stepped over backwards to tolerate them, to the point where BYU had the Relief Society president nodding their heads in agreement as a lesbian came up and told him that God loves me exactly as I am and approves of me totally. And that is simply not true.
I have a friend that I've interviewed a few times that's had lunch with a few apostles, and he does occasionally. He asked them that question, and the reason that was given, and I don't even know if all the 15 men agree with this apostle. Who knows? They might have their own ideas about it. Who knows how much they actually converse about this specific topic? But he said the reason they are no longer, for instance, they're not allowed to write books anymore. Did you know that? They're not allowed to write any books anymore. But here's the thing. The reason they don't say anything politically against the establishment or the powers that be is because they're focusing on an international church. They need to build temples. They need to be friends with these diplomats and these magistrates and these kings and these princes and these dictators even. And they wouldn't be able to get into these countries if we were patriotic about the United States of America and critical about communism and critical about tyranny.
Well, you can do both. It's true that you have to be careful, but you can, for example, without mentioning the U.S. Constitution, talk about the principles of liberty, for example. You can talk about the dangers of raw democracy, whereby the majority has the power to take away other people's rights just by majority rule, and why that's not right. You can talk about the dangers of dictatorship, and yeah, they can imply he's talking about us, but so be it. The point is, we're never going to get the gospel into China in an open way unless you completely give in and kowtow to communism. They're not going to allow that. So the point is, there's a certain misinterpretation among the hierarchy of BYU and the religion department and others that taking the gospel to all the world before the second coming means you actually have to get in and get permission to openly teach the gospel, and that's simply not true. The gospel has already gone to all the world. It's always available through the internet, etc. You don't have to kowtow to dictators to be able to get the gospel in. You're never going to get the gospel in an open way into Muslim countries or communist countries because you have satanic control there. They're not going to let it happen. That doesn't mean that the gospel has to go to every person in every single country in order to fulfill.
It says penetrate every continent. It doesn't
right.
Convert every person in every country of that continent, right? I'm speaking of the standard of truth.
Well, in missionary work, you're often taught if we could only have the right approach, we could reach and convert everybody, and that's just not true. It stems from this. It stems from this fairy tale doctrine that everybody who came to Earth, of the 2/3, raised their arm to the square and supported the gospel in Jesus Christ. And it's simply not true. I mean, you have in Abraham chapter 5 about Cain. where the Lord says, you were master mayhem and perdition before the world was. Now, a person who's perdition before the world was did not raise his hand to the square. He came down as an ally of Satan. That's why he's master mayhem and powerful over Satan, because he got to come to earth, get a body, and learn all the things about earth. But the Hitlers and the Stalins and the Lenins of the world, these are people who made covenants with Satan before this world. And everybody else is in between. There are people who didn't, you get this fairy tale image all sitting at the feet of the Savior in a family home evening type thing with trillions of children lauding and listening to every word. And that's just simply not the way the pre-earth life worked. I mean, we were watching what's going on Earth and getting infected by some of us saw the battle for liberty and became champions of liberty up there. And others were just wanted to do worldly things down there. Beethoven and Mozart were busy composing music on spiritual pianos there and interacting with each other. And that's why they come to earth and have all this musical thing. It's already in their soul from their pre-existent experience. But you see, people get infected by bad things. That's why you have a wave of worldly children. Yeah, they're computer savvy from the time they're tiny because they've been working with this technology before they came here. But the point is, they're also infected by worldly things, and that's why they're very resistant to many. Look at the music. Music is a very interesting thing that's happened. You had these waves of musical history that came down, the classical period, then the romantic classical period, and other things. And this is because, everybody in the pre-existence wants to do something improved or new to change the status quo. When I go down there, I want to do this and this, and I want to change this and this musical thing. Well, you had probably the high point of American music from the 20s through the early 50s called the Great American Songbook. The most beautiful melodies ever created, and the most famous songbooks of wonderful music, those things sung by Sinatra and the Letterman and other, really wonderful things. Of course, you had the classical period with the great musics of Beethoven, but even that tended to go over the mark. You had it got into weird, strange things that only a scholar could understand where the music was doing, because it's disjointed and dissonant. It no longer had beautiful melodies interwoven with it. And the same thing happened with the Great American Songbook. You had jazz come in, and the original jazz improvisations stayed closely to the melody and improved and did little interesting things, beautiful. And then you had wild jazz starting up. And then it turned
Dave
to
Brubeck.
rock.
I love Dave Brubeck.
Well, yeah, but then you have some jazz that is just undecipherable. It's just all over the map, and it has no bearing to the melody, and it's dissonant and dark. And then, of course, you had rock came in, and the early rock music had melody and was complete songs. And then you got into wild and rock. And nowadays, you don't have any songs at all, any, that are a total melody like you had in the
it's an evil frequency.
Well, they are just little tonal statements, 4 or 5 measures long, maybe 2 measures long, and they repeat it, they scream it, they yell it, they are passionate with a heavy drum beat, and that's music today. There is not a single melody that you can remember, because they're all tonal, passion-driven, hard-driving things. And there are people, the young people are attached to this. They like it. And people like me who long for beautiful melodies and wonderful soul calming things can't tolerate the jarring nature of the modern music, or the extreme pressure and passion of the music, which is destabilizing. It's not stabilizing. And you see, but people come predisposed to some of these. There are waves of homosexuality that are created in the pre-existent. Ooh, I want to try that when I go down here. And they do. And there's a lot of satanic involvement, in convincing people that they are not of their biological gender, etc. So this is part of the great deconstruction of America that I talked about in my big picture speech 2 weeks ago in Utah. And in the World Affairs Brief 2 weeks ago, I had a summation of my big picture speech, the deconstruction of America through the woke agenda and through public schooling and all the children are being indoctrinated on.
Hey, I agree. I mean, it's preposterous to think we uh that we progress the same way in the premortal life. I bring that up all the time to my listeners, that to think that Joseph Smith could have just been randomly born here into a family that didn't, like some third world country that didn't even know Christianity, is absurd. He was We were all foreordained because of who we were and because of our agency from the foundations of the world. And
Now,
patriarchal
I would
blessings talk
disagree.
about.
I would disagree that everybody has a wonderful foreordination
No,
towards,
no, no, but they weren't randomly just thrown down here. That's what
but you
I'm
see,
trying.
people are no different up there than they were here. You have people who simply are clueless about life.
Right.
They don't have a mission in life. They're just existing. They're just going through the motions. They're just surviving, the experience. And they were the same way up there. We tend to implant our theology of foreordination knowledge and about the doctrine on everybody, and it's just not true.
No.
And you have very few people were committed to the gospel before they came here. Very few people understood the voice of the Lord before they came here. And the 84 section, starting about the verse 59 or so, is the most important exposition on what happens about innateness, where you come here and you're given a little light of Christ things, and those that respond get more. And then he makes the dramatic statement, those that do not come unto me, it is because of sin. And that's a pretty dramatic statement. You mean those that don't finally make it back to the Lord's because of sin, not ignorance, because everybody has sufficient through the light of Christ to put them on the path to start. And you have to then agree with that and want more, and you get a little more and a little more. And at any point you start to rebel and say, I don't want any more of that, that's sin.
Yeah.
That is the sin. And that's what the Lord said. If you come not of me, it is because of sin, because you did not know me and you did not want me. Now, that's a very important thing. That same section talks about this is the great sin that brings the whole church under condemnation. And the whole sin is that they believe because you got a temple recommend, you're generally following the commandments, that that's all I need to do. Rejecting the myriad of promptings and warnings that come from conscience all day long about your temporal habits, what you watch on television, whether you use weight control, whether you exercise, whether you know, how you treat your fellow human being, all those little promptings. Don't say that. You say it anyway. You're in constant violation of the promptings, and that's the condemnation that brings the church under condemnation. And the Lord says, what's the solution? Well, read the Book of Mormon. And it's not that the Book of Mormon has the answers to all that. It doesn't. But it teaches you what it's like to hear the voice of the Lord in your mind so that you can recognize the Spirit of the Lord versus Satan, who's always camped right on your shoulder. You don't have to feel dark or dingy when Satan is. He gives you comforting talks. He gives you unconditional love ideas. He gives you're okay no matter what you do. The Lord accepts you no matter what you think or what. He gives you things you want to believe in that match your innateness. So you have to watch out to distinguish between the pushing feelings of the Lord, getting you to overcome your weaknesses, versus the comforting feelings of the Lord, of Satan, trying to
Mm-hmm.
get you to feel satisfied with where you are so that you don't progress. Now, if you listen to his voice long enough, you'll get into depression and suicidal thoughts. And all suicide comes from satanic depression. It may start with physical depression. It may start with something, but it ends up with satanic.
Absolutely. And it's funny because it's never his complacency is never accompanied with real feelings of love like you get from the Savior. Hey, I want to hit on, how much time do you have left?
15 minutes.
Okay. Can we just briefly hit on some points? I don't know if you can cover all of, like, say, take maybe 3 minutes on each. I don't know if you can, though, or pick one or two. But things going on in the world, we're talking about power outages, civil war, even Uh, the World Economic Forum, you're hearing a lot of that going around. How about Biden threatening to go to war with Russia? Because Germany and Poland are going into somewhat of a civil emergency because of Ukraine losing the war. Do you see, and then how about we hit on one or two of those? But do you see
All right.
Israel also,
Yeah.
is Israel losing support from the West? I know we don't have time to talk about all this, but
All right, let's first of all talk about Biden's statement about, if you don't support Ukraine, we're going to be sending your troops to fight against Russia. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's obviously just a puppet. He's got a talking point from his advisors who do know what they're talking about. And even though they don't mention it, this is what I talked about in one of our original interviews. In fact, that conservatives in the United States are woefully ignorant about the fact that the Soviets faked their own demise. The fall of the Soviet Union never happened. All right, they just went underground and they faked their own demise to get Western aid and trade. And eventually, through Putin, they're trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union by reinvading the countries. Now, remember that the Baltic states used to be part of the Soviet Union: Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. The Russians, before the phony fall, moved in hundreds of thousands of Russians into those three Baltic states to have the same excuse that they used by moving the Russians into Donbass and Crimea into Ukraine. They moved both of those Russian-speaking territories into the boundaries of Ukraine so they'd have an excuse to invade. And that's exactly the excuse that Putin used, was that they're being persecuted, they don't have their rights, and so we're going to invade in order to defend these Russian-speaking peoples. Well, the globalists, by the way, who have always done unjustified interventions around the world during the phony war on terror years, because of the deep state 9/11 operation, which created the war on terror,
right,
which they created. But the globalists, who, as I explained to your audience before, have always been building Russia and China. They brought them to power. They brought the communists to power in both Russia and China. They gave $20 million for the Bolshevik Revolution in gold. They gave them the plans to the nuclear weapons they couldn't steal. They gave them the first shipment of enriched uranium so that the Soviets, who didn't know how to enrich uranium, could explode their first nuclear weapon in 1949. They let them have the miniature ball bearing technology to MIRV their missiles. They've given them and allowed them to spy and steal technology because they want an enemy for another Third World War. But before that Third World War, as I've long explained in my World Affairs brief, they had to switch sides. They had to start warning about Russia so they don't get blamed for this war when they do go to war. And there's going to be a war between Russia and China and the West, because we've created them specifically for that purpose, and we need it. Our own globalist leaders need it to drive us into a militarized global government. And so it's only natural that they're going to say, if you don't stop Russia in Ukraine, and they're right, even though they're evil globalists, they're right, because Russia is building up right now and is in a full wartime production for artillery shells and missiles. And if you don't keep draining their manpower and their missiles and their artillery in the war in Ukraine, if they win back Ukraine, for example, and you give them 6 months, they're going to be ready to attack another state, probably the Baltics, under the same excuse. And that's what the advisors told Biden to tell the American people about: your soldiers sent to fight to Russia, because we have a treaty with NATO. If they invade the Baltics, which are part of NATO, then we've got a treaty obligation.
So we're using the Ukraine to exhaust the Russian artillery so that we can go in later, you think?
Not go in.
Not go in, but
just so that Russia is weakened conventionally. Because remember, this is a very important geopolitical strategic point. Russia cannot nuke the West because it doesn't have the conventional power to occupy. Important. If you nuke somebody and you can't occupy, they just rebuild and come back after you later. Okay? All right. With a vengeance. So you see, by weakening Russia conventionally, the globalists are correctly postponing the nuclear war until what? China's ready. because China does have the manpower.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't think occupation is necessarily a given in the U.S. because you got a billion arms in private hands, and that's a recipe for guerrilla warfare, par none. But the point is that these are three satanic driven conspiracies. Our own Western globalists trying to get us into a militarized global government without national sovereignty. Russia and China are satanic driven, tyrannical governments aimed at doing their own version of the New World Order, which will not be anything pleasant at all. You don't want to live under Chinese occupation or Russian occupation. But the point is that only if they jointly attack the U.S., and it won't be the cities, it's going to be the military targets because they don't want to destroy the infrastructure that they depend upon. They want to simply destroy the military and then blackmail us into submission. That's how they want to start their new world order. And I won't take the time to go through it. We touched on that somewhat
Right.
before. But the point is that we are going to face nuclear war. And in my big picture briefing, I said, there's a week coming up, probably in the latter part of this decade, when China is finally ready to join with Russia in striking the U.S. military. There's a week that will change the world and it'll never recover. And that's when the grid goes down and nuclear weapons fall on our military. We get into a global new world order with a mark of the beast citizenship requirement where you can't become a professional or have a job or own anything without taking the mark. We're going to live to see that happen. And so that's what the Ukraine war is really all about. And I know conservatives are loath to believe that the globalists could ever do anything right. And they're not doing it for the right reasons. They're doing it simply to save themselves from blame for having built these enemies in an evil fashion for many years.
All right. Now, what's going on with so why is Germany and Poland panicking?
Well,
this?
Poland obviously is right next to Belarus, and they could be invaded very easily on that. And by the way, Alex Jones went off the wall with Jack Posobiec about, this is an open declaration of preparing for war with Russia. It isn't. It's an emergency, and because there's no way to get the European Union to continue to fund Ukraine. In fact, there's Republicans don't understand anything about this, the long-term reason about why Ukraine is important. Not because Ukraine isn't corrupt. It is corrupt. Remember, in the phony fall of the Soviet, they didn't remove any of the communist leaders from the bureaucracy and the political system in any of those countries. And so Ukraine was full of communists acting as if they're now nationalists, and there's all that corruption with Joe Biden. All that was because of former communists.
And Zelensky is just a puppet, and he's going along with the whole thing.
He's corrupt, moral, etc. But that doesn't mean the Ukraine people deserve to live under the continuing Soviets, represented by Vladimir Putin, which won't be nice for them at all. I mean, he's just destroyed so much infrastructure, etc. But you can't let Putin get away, can't let the Russians get away with faking their own demise, getting aid and trade, and then taking back these other nations. But as much as I've been a lone voice in the wilderness, I can't get conservatives over their one-track mind that Russia has to be good because Ukraine is corrupt. It's just not true.
Yeah.
But Poland is on the front lines, and Germany. Now, Olaf Scholz is a leftist. He's now turned into a globalist, just like Tony Blair, a leftist, arch leftist, turned into a globalist. Once you get into power, you got to tout the ruling class, which is the globalist class, and they rule every one of these Western countries through their own deep state. So he's turned into a globalist and going to do an emergency in order to get aid to Ukraine, but not because they're actually going to go against Russia.
Gotcha.
That's only scare tactics to talk the people into their emergency declaration. And I'm covering that in this week's World Affairs Brief.
Yeah, that's what exactly. Thank you on that. One more thing before you go. Israel, are they losing support from the West? And if so, did you see this coming?
Well,
and why?
First of all, we've covered the fact in a previous episode that Israel allowed this to happen. They knew it was coming. They issued a stand down. They pulled their troops out of southern Israel to make it easier for the Hamas to attack, being that the Israeli military was now 6 to 7 hours away. They vowed now we're going to go in to eradicate. I think the purpose of standing down and creating and allowing this attack to happen was to provoke a war with Iran, which they've been itching to get after. And so is the U.S. globalists. They can't stand a Muslim power that is independent in their military production facilities, independent of East or West. But that didn't work out. Iran won't take the bait. Israel is insisting on trying to eliminate Hamas, which is stupid. You can't, among 2.3 million people, eliminate 50,000 Hamas fighters. Now they're going to put a dent in it, but they won't eliminate it. And there's thousands more irritated Gazans that will become Hamas activists as they grow up. So you'll have it again in another 10 years. There will never be any peace in the Middle East. Israel's not a righteous country. The Arabs are not a righteous people. They voted for Hamas. It's at least half of the people. The civilian population are all relatively innocent, except for their ignorance and not understanding the secret combinations which control each of their countries, whether it's Hamas and its terrorism or Israel and its globalist deep state president or Netanyahu or Prime Minister Netanyahu, who's a Henry Kissinger protege. But yes, they are losing international support because of the Gaza casualty rate. And when you're going to save your own troops by bombing rather than going house to house, you're going to create, 5-to-1 casualties to your own soldiers. And that's what's happening. It's not going to solve the problem. Hamas will survive this. Israel's in southern Israel now, trying to eradicate Hamas and flooding their tunnels with seawater and foam and poison gas and everything they can do. And Hamas is putting hostages down there, some of which have already been killed by the attacks on the tunnel system. But I just have lost faith in any peace in Israel. It's anything but a peaceful country and never will be. Evil rules the world, and so we have to get used to that.
But it's not Armageddon. This is not Armageddon.
No, this is not the Battle of Armageddon.
Okay.
That comes much later, right before 3 years before the second coming.
Well, when I'm hearing losing support, it almost seems like, was Israel put in this position to make them look bad? Like preliminarily this support at the beginning, and now they're annihilating the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, and now they look bad, but who knows? And then that brings on an Armageddon-like war. But
eventually, yes, and
it's going to be resentment for the Jews eventually.
Yeah, but remember, the U.S. has done the same thing in its war on terror. They created the image of the U.S. as the bully of the world. They did that on purpose. That's why they created ISIS to go rampaging through the world. And of course, the Arabs knew that these were U.S. funded. That was only the Americans were denied the information about U.S. funding of ISIS and protecting them. But you see, that helps give Russia and China an excuse to attack the U.S. someday, as we were just going after the bully of the world. And there's a lot of the world that believes that. And so Israel's doing the same thing. They're giving themselves an image of a pretty ruthless, and they're pretty ruthless with the people. They did the horrible COVID restrictions. They did the biggest vaccine mandate of ever. They have the biggest surveillance of their own citizens. So they're like our own deep state in a mini version. They're in their own country.
Yeah. Joel, thank you so much for being here. Please come back again. Love having you. Learn a lot from you, and my followers adore you.
Yes, thank you, Troy. Yeah, it'll be good to have a monthly session with you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.